back again. And once again, there's going to be a QR code at the end, so be at the ready. It's a blog post about MPoC Labs, if that sounds interesting to you. So, just a brief history. We won't spend too much time on this, but there might be some folks in the room, myself included, that actually remembers the payment acceptance devices when they were very, very simple. Just simple pin pads, usually just the pin entry. If you were lucky, they had an LCD, and you might remember that was covered by the PCI PED standard. And as we know, that's evolved quite a bit over the years. 2 multifunction PEDs, we now have touch entry, and we have dedicated card readers. And so that evolved from PCI PED to what we now know as PTS POI. PTS being pin transaction security, POI point of interaction. We also know, and everyone's familiar, because you probably have one in your pocket or at the ready for that QR code at the end, mobile payment systems. And instead of evolving the POI standard, there's a new suite of standards at the council that you see there, with the latest iteration being MPoC, which is the focus of today. So everything you see here is on the document library on the council website as we speak. This isn't the very latest version yet, but all of these documents are published. 1.0.1 is the document published now, and that will soon be superseded or replaced by 1.1, accompanied by an updated program guide as well as technical FAQs. But let's get into the real meat of it. So version 1.0.1, we did an RFC, and thank you to everyone that contributed feedback to that. And you actually, that screenshot you see of that laptop, that's actually real screenshots of all the red line to the draft based on all the feedback that we received and the changes made to help develop 1.1. But you can see some of the items of feedback. Some people felt lab testing MPoC apps a little too burdensome. Was there something that we could do there? We need support for more POI devices. So for those that are familiar with the SCRP device that's part of the PCI PTS POI standard, maybe that was a little bit too restrictive. Could we increase that? More product types for increased deployment opportunities. Some folks felt probably requirements in there we might revisit. Are they necessary? And also along the lines with key management, maybe a little bit too strict. And the definition of COTS itself, commercial off the shelf. And again, just to revisit for those that may not be familiar, so MPoC mobile payment on COTS, and the COTS part is really devices that are not purposefully built for payment acceptance, and that really is the differentiator between the PTS POI standard. So this is just a categorization of feedback. We do go through all the RFC, and it's always interesting to look at how everything gets categorized. And I know the text is a bit small. The colors represent the different entities that provided feedback, and then we categorize that, and it's nice to look at themes of where various pieces of feedback aggregate to see where people are focused on, and it does help drive the changes for the draft standard. And this is the disposition. So as we finish up a draft and go through all of that great feedback that we get, this gives you an idea of how we dispositioned it, and you can see the vast majority of that feedback was adopted in some way for the new version 1.1. All right, I'm going to focus on a few of these bullet points, starting with the first one. It's going to sound like a tongue twister when I say it, probably. But those that are familiar, there's the context of an isolated SDK in MPoC. And an isolated SDK is such that it's not exposing the sensitive assets to the MPoC application that SDK would get integrated into. So that's a very important context. So where there's an isolated SDK, and it's going to be integrated into an MPoC app, the vendor of that isolated SDK can verify that integration into that app without the need for lab testing. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. The second bullet there, you're probably familiar with the term MPoC A&M service. That now is an MPoC service that can consist of an A&M being attestation and monitoring, but it could also now be attestation and monitoring plus payment processing functionality. So that'll be a new change. Also new is the ability for an SDK to integrate another SDK. This one about the removal of secure software. So for the backend A&M, that actually has been removed. So that was a significant piece of feedback that was received during the RFC process. And then, as always, whenever we do a standard revision, we look at what our current technical FAQs are. And the FAQ mechanism is really a means to provide interim clarification or guidance in between revisions. So when we do a revision, we want to integrate as much of that as we can into the updated standard. And as we mentioned on the feedback that perhaps the definition of COTS was too restrictive, that has been updated as well to allow a little bit more flexibility. And you'll see in the updated wording a context for enterprise devices as well. So just looking, going back to that piece of feedback where we're talking about the device, and I mentioned the SCRP, Secure Card Reader, that now you could see in the orange is now a POI device. So that offers greater flexibility because now where that PIN entry was entered on the COTS device, the ability of that POI device allows that PIN entry to either be on the COTS device or, if supported, through that POI device, which again can be much more multifunctional than just the use of that specific secure card reader. So another piece of the feedback that we highlighted was the deployment scenarios. So on the screen, you're going to see various aspects that would ultimately comprise an MPoC solution, with the three different categories being the software, the service that we talked about, as well as the overall solution. So the software part might look familiar for those that are, have familiarity with MPoC, but where we're going to see a bit more flexibility is both in the service and the overall solution. So in this scenario, this is what your service might look like. And again, it consists of that attestation and monitoring part of it. But it might also look like that. So I'll let everyone kind of take a quick look, so I'm not going through too quickly. But it might also look like that. So again, based on that feedback, it was recognized we needed much more flexibility for folks in the deployment scenarios and how they ultimately comprise those different MPoC products, and the products being the software, the service, or ultimately the entire solution. So going to a solution, that might be one particular deployment scenario. And by the way, all of this will be detailed in the updated standard with the appropriate text. So when that does come out, it'll have all the requisite details for folks to read. But your solution might also look like that as well. So essentially, a lot of different flexibility for folks on how they're going to assemble their ultimate MPoC solution. So what about SDKs? I mentioned SDKs. I said we'd get back to that in a bit. It's been the case that an application can integrate SDKs. But as mentioned in 1.1, now an SDK can integrate another SDK. In this context, you see they're both doing the same thing, payment and A&M. But it doesn't have to be that way. The SDKs can implement different functionality. Now that functionality in this case is related to MPoC, but that doesn't have to be the case. You might have part of the SDK that isn't implementing security functions or MPoC-related functionality, as you see here. So again, now with the ability to integrate an SDK into another SDK, and then that integration into the application, and having varying functionality across those composite pieces, it offers a lot of flexibility in the updated standard. And here, I know the images are slightly small, but the main takeaway here is, as has been in 1.0 and 1.0.1, where you have MPoC-related functionality, that would go through lab testing. But if we skip down to the bottom, as I mentioned, where you have that isolated SDK, you're integrating that into an application. In this case, it's showing being integrated from SDK1 to SDK2, SDK2 and SDK1. There's the potential, it's not required, but there's the potential now for the vendor of that SDK to verify that integration. And there will be detail in the program documents for this vendor verification process. So that, again, we go back to that RFC feedback item where maybe some of the app testing or maybe elements of the software was a little bit too burdensome. And so this might provide relief without having to require lab testing under particular circumstances. And if we focus right in the middle, this is always that anyone that's heard the council speak has heard the phrase, "it depends." There are going to be cases where it depends. And it may depend on the exact functionality that's being implemented. And so really example 3 there is just highlighting there might be times where the functionality might bring in lab testing, but there's going to be times where the functionality does not bring in lab testing. So it does potentially come down to a use case, but overall there will be a new vendor verification process for integration that can be done by the vendor of that SDK. And this is what folks are waiting for. So 1.1 very soon, before the end of the year. The intent is we will first put out the updated 1.1 standard, and then a very short follow will be the program document. So that's the program guide, reporting templates, any additional tech FAQs that may have come about that sometimes is useful. So all the program documents will be published after the standard. And it's very exciting times. It's on the verge. We're almost there. So we look forward to that. And as I mentioned at the end, QR code. So there is a new streamlined onboarding process for labs. So folks, I don't know how familiar you are with the lab process. It was the case that they needed to first, as a prerequisite, be a PTS lab. And that's kind of the original lab designation for PIN transaction security. And now it's possible that they do not, as a prerequisite, need to be a PTS lab. So what you see there is a little extract from the blog post, but that's out on the website in the newsroom on the PCI SSC page, and there's the QR code that goes directly to that blog post. So that will be very exciting. If you have interest in that, please do go out and read that. It's got more detail than you see here. And with that, thank you. I know that was fairly quick. Exciting times, and please do look for all the communication that will come out when it does get published. So we're excited. And once again, cannot thank the community enough for the amount of engagement that we had for MPoC. And all of those draft changes is really a result of that community engagement and getting that feedback. We had a lot of meetings, we had the RFCs, and it's really the community and all the people in this room that helped drive that effort and get these changes made and get it out. So thank you, really appreciate it.